Tonight we're going to be taking a look at another motion picture that is related to the study of hero mythology. We're going to be taking a look at Marvel's Thor. Earlier in the semester we took a look at Batman Begins. We had a little bit of a discussion about how modern comic books are a version of mythology. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the presentation tonight. But we are going to be turning away from DC and focusing in on their chief rival historically in the comic book industry, the company Marvel. If you're not familiar with the story in the Marvel universe, the story of Thor, hopefully you know a little bit about the character from Norse mythology, because the character has been around a lot longer than the company known as Marvel Comics. So what I'm going to do tonight is actually not only walk you through parts of the movie. I'm not going to go through an entire overview of the hero's journey the way I did with Batman Begins, but I'm going to go through the highlights of the story. And as we go through the movie Thor, I definitely want to focus in on something we haven't talked very much about. If I've mentioned it, it's kind of in passing, but I want to focus on psychological theory by a pioneer in psychoanalysis by the name of Otto Rank, who was a student of Sigmund Freud. And we're going to look at his theory that's known as the family romance. Okay, so I'll introduce that to you as we begin, but let's take a look first at the movie Thor. Dying, Rising, and Romance is what I'm calling this one. So we're going to be talking about this whole idea of dying and rising, which is a standard motif, right, in the hero stories. We've been seeing this all along. We're going to be seeing it all the way through the semester. Romance, here I'm using in the context of Otto Rank's theory, the family romance. But of course, a lot of heroic legend is in the form of romance, as we'll see when we get to King Arthur later this semester. All right, so with that being said, let's take a look at comic books and mythology one more time. Let's start with the advent of modern mythology, which is actually 1938. I probably should have put that in there instead of 1939, but we've been talking about Batman, so I figured I'd just introduce you again to Detective Comics number 27, which is the introduction of my personal favorite hero of the modern era, Batman. We already talked about how the story is really modern mythology, right? The comic book genre, that whole type of literature, is a living tradition in the sense that you've got hero stories that are alive and being told and retold by various writers with artists over the generations, not only in the comic books themselves, but also translated into the cinema. Beginning really early on, if you think about it, you might not be familiar, but in the old cinema of the earlier 20th century, not long after these characters first come on the stage, you have the movie serials being produced featuring characters from the comic books. Now, comic books, again, this might be a little bit of a recap of what we've talked about in the past, but it didn't start out as the superhero genre. Comic books started out with basically a collection of comic strips from the newspapers compiled into a book form, and then there are all kinds of different types of comic books published in those early years, including romance and detective stories, etc. As a matter of fact, Detective Comics, which is where DC gets its DC name from, was originally basically detective stories. And that's where Batman kind of comes in if you don't know much about Batman, which is, shame on you if you don't. He is, the Dark Knight detective. That's his greatest skill, is basically his detective skills, even though it's usually played down in most motion pictures today. The advent of the superhero really comes in in 1938 with the character of Superman, right? And those types of heroes, those types of characters rather, become so popular that they really dominate the entire industry, or even up to the modern day, even though you still have other types of stories told. I think it's the superhero genre that's the most well-known. Now, when I was saying they're modern mythology, like I said, you're telling and retelling these stories, and a lot of the stories, particularly geared towards the hero narrative, are going to be the superhero stories. All right, so we're dealing with modern mythology, and in the mix now, I want to throw in a reference again to ancient mythology, in particular the Norse tradition, with a character like Thor. Right, Thor is nothing new. Most of the average, moviegoer today knows Thor because of Marvel and their movies. The name is probably already well known by a good number of people, but not everybody knows the basic story from Norse mythology, the authentic story, the traditional tales of the hero, right? The god of thunder. So this is ancient mythology that is now, well, not right now, but since the 1960s has been combined with the superhero genre, which is why you have the Thor comic books. Okay, and of course, Thor actually arose or premiered rather in Journey into Mystery number 83 back in 1962. So this is Marvel's version of Thor. So when we talk about the movie that we're about to discuss, we're not talking about the traditional Norse mythological version, but we're talking about the modern superhero version, which is going to include obvious references to the ancient mythology, but there are also significant changes to those tales. All right, and we may point out certain things as we go, but again, that's a very quick overview. So we've got the genre. Now, let's talk about some psychology. The family romance. Otto Rank, very important thinker in the earlier 20th century, was a student of Sigmund Freud's, and one of his most famous works is a book called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero. In it, he's going to focus on the early phase of the developing hero. And it's really a psychoanalytic approach to myth and family relationships, okay? Because his theory is basically about the dynamics in the family, right? And at its core, he believes that hero myth was about these family relationships, and in particular, certain rivalries, possessive rivalries that emerge within the family, particularly between fathers and sons, all right? So we're going to talk a little bit about this family dynamic, which, according to Rank, evolves and changes throughout the development of a child, right? You have this phase in your early life where you're struggling to find your place within the family, and then eventually, and this is a brief overview because I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit in a while, but you eventually have to find your place not only within the family, you have to eventually find your place within society, kind of outside the family. So there's this tension between your role inside and outside the family. Okay, it's part of the process of growing, maturing, and developing, as all hero myths are, right? Now, one's independence from the parents is an essential part of this transition into being a member of the greater community. Now, Rank actually sees the Oedipus complex as really important and driving as a driving force in the family dynamic. And he believes that this is the thing that generates the hero myth. Right? So the hero's mission in these stories is to overcome the figure of the tyrannical parent, right? The tyrannical father figure. And the hero sees the parent as an oppressive figure characterized as an aggressor. And the interesting thing is, Rank points out, that it's kind of a reversal or projection of the actual Oedipal feelings of the child. Meaning the child is the one who sees the father as a threat. If you remember the Oedipus complex, we brought it up briefly at the beginning of the semester and looked at, the story of Oedipus himself and how you've got this, as a quick refresher, this idea of a animosity towards the father and a sexual desire for the mother, where you want to remove the father from the picture and possess the mother. That's a very, very brief overview of the Oedipus complex. And like it, I should have mentioned the Electra complex, which was the parallel version that deals with girls, okay, and their parents. So Electra, by the way, also comes from mythology. If you're not familiar with the character of Electra, this is the daughter of Agamemnon, who is a really important character in the Trojan War, which we haven't really covered yet, but she is the sister of the hero Orestes, who murders his mother in vengeance for the murder of his father by his mother. Okay, again, we're not going to get into that story right now, but he sees this as, the thing that brings about the hero narrative, okay? So the child has this animosity towards the father, but when we say there's a reversal or projection, it's the child then viewing the father as the one who has those aggressive feelings, or as the threat to the child, okay? Now, and this is kind of the backdrop for the emerging hero narrative, and I'm going to lay that out in a little bit of a, kind of a formalized way in just a second. I'm going to break it down into the various stages that Otto Rank presents in his book. But for now, I just want to reinforce the idea that we're focusing on the early years of the hero's life with the early phase of the family romance. Okay, so it's not going to cover the entire heroic journey the way Campbell does. It's really specific to that aspect of the hero's development. All right, so let's talk about the family romance in some basic stages. In the early phase, you've got the child who idolizes and idealizes the parents. And this is typical of very young children. All right, Rank would point this out, that children, when they're, 2, 3 even 4 years of age, they're attached to the parents very closely, right? They always want to be with the parents. They're like the best friends, right? The child has that attachment. Doesn't like to be separated from the parents. It's very uncomfortable to be separated. But that's a process that we all need to go through, right? To be able to build that distance and start to socialize with other people, other children of their own age, and so on. But that initial attachment is going to need to be overcome, and that's part of this process. At some point, as the child starts to mature and grow, they're going to start to see this ideal parent as less than ideal. They're going to start to become disillusioned, maybe, with different aspects of the parent. I've just noticed, I might as well use some examples from my own life. I've got, I was going to say a 3-year-old. He just turned 4, but he always wants me to play with him and do this with him and hold him and carry him, and he's like attached to my hip when I'm not putting him back, so I can get to my class lectures and stuff. But at the same time, very recently, he'll start saying things, especially when I might scold him for doing something he's not supposed to do. He'll say, "You're a bad parent." I don't know where he got that from, but I guess that's the beginning of this phase, right, where you're becoming disillusioned. You start to see flaws and imperfections in the parent figure, okay? And again, that's natural. Doesn't feel real good, but it's natural, all right? So the child at some point is going to maybe have a desire for a higher social status. Maybe they're going to look at the family situation as it is, where they are. Not that they understand society all that much at the early stage, but they're going to desire something better, right? Maybe a return to this kind of ideal situation. And they're going to start to measure their parents against other adults that they come into contact with, right? They might have friends that have parents, and you'll see how their friends react with their parents and how those parents behave. And they're going to start to, decide, how does my parent measure up to those parents, right? So that kind of comparison is going to be going on. And in the midst of this, they're going to start to feel rejection. They're going to start to feel a separation begin. Could be a little bit traumatic. At some point, they're also going to recognize that the parents are sexual beings, right? There's a sexual nature to the parents' relationship, father and mother. And that, of course, is something none of us want to think about, but again, it's a natural process, and this is, again, the beginning of that Oedipal phase, Freud would say, right? So the Oedipal complex comes in where you've got this resentment towards the father, the desire for the mother, and again, I'm talking mainly about the male child here. At least I'm using that as the example. All right, so that takes place as step 7 or stage 7. And then there's ultimately the disappointment. The parents fail to meet your expectations, and you start to imagine a better situation. You start to fantasize about what would life be like without them, right? What would it be like for me to be independent? Or maybe that will also include an imagination about better parents, right? Maybe their true parents are out there somewhere else, and those true parents are of higher status, and they have this desire to kind of return to their real parents and maybe get rid of these lame examples that they are stuck with right now. So now this kind of mental game or mental imaginative situation is then projected into the realm of storytelling, right? This is where the hero story is going to emerge. And the pattern that Rank outlines is going to be something like this. Okay, we're going to set it up as we did before in 3 stages. All right, the 3 stages for Rank's family romance: the true home, the exile, and then the return. Again, a counterpart to Joseph Campbell's separation, initiation, return. It's the same thing, but we're focused on that early phase again of the child's development or the hero's development. Okay? And again, it's a transformative process, as we saw in just a second ago. The whole thing is about transformation. All right, so here's the basic pattern. I'm going to lay this out kind of step by step, and then we're going to take a look at the movie. So it starts off with the birth of the child. Again, this is in the story. The child is born, usually related to gods, as many heroes often are, or to kings. Okay, so this idea of a noble birth. There's a good social status that the story starts with. The problem is there are difficulties in conceiving the child or difficulties in giving birth to the child. There's something difficult in those early moments. When the child is born, there's usually a negative prophecy. We've seen some of these patterns already in some stories, so I'll let you guys think back to these, even though I may throw out some examples off and on, but we're going to see some definite patterns like this in stories coming up, particularly when we get to the story of Paris, in the story of the Trojan War, story of King Arthur. You're going to see a lot of this kind of thing work out. So the negative prophecy, again, something to be avoided. again, just use Oedipus, I guess, as a story we've already seen where you've got the same deal. The child is exposed, meaning abandoned to die, left to die in the wilderness, maybe placed in the water, some kind of liminal experience where he's basically transitioned into, cut off from society, right? They cross over into that wild boundary where, hopefully they'll be dead. This idea of, again, transitioning between the world of the living and the world of the dead, because you want to get rid of a child if it is going to manifest some kind of negative future. I mean, that's the idea. So with Oedipus, right, the idea was he was going to grow up to murder his father and marry his mother, and his father and mother then abandon him and hopefully leave him to die, which he doesn't. Okay, so that's this aspect. The next stage is he's rescued. The child is rescued either by animals, in some cases, like Romulus and Remus, who I may mention when we get to the Roman mythology in a couple weeks, or by lowly individuals, right, commoners, not the kings and gods of their original birth. The next stage, okay, I guess this would be stage 6, is they're going to then be reared. They're going to be raised in this world, either by the animal or the commoner, the common woman. The hero is going to grow up and emerge as a hero at some point. The hero is going to discover who his natural parents are, his noble background and birth, and then he's going to go on to exact vengeance upon the father that abandoned him, or the family, or ultimately maybe even a reconciliation with the father. There's something that resolves that situation, and at the very end, the character is going to be acknowledged by the father and hopefully receive a position, maybe a throne or maybe honor. Okay, so that's the pattern that Rank lays out. Now, what I want to do next is we're going to turn to the movie and we're going to see how this pattern actually manifests in the film Thor. Okay, let's take a look at our first clip dealing with the royal family of Asgard, and I hopefully have the volume up where you guys can hear it.
Only one of you can ascend to the throne, but both of you were born to be kings.
Okay, you get the idea there. They're both born to be kings. Again, that's kind of a hint at a destiny. And whoops, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing here. I meant to change the volume in case that was a little too low. I'm going to boost the volume for you guys. So, okay, you can let me know on the next slide whether that has succeeded. Anyways, all right, so here we're introduced to the character of Odin very briefly. The Allfather. If you, again, know your Norse mythology, you know exactly who Odin is. He's going to be really big in the story that we're going to be covering next, which is going to be the Volsunga saga. But again, he is, out of all the characters in Norse mythology, the most important figure in Norse mythology. You're also introduced to Thor and Loki, who are probably the two other most well-known characters next to Odin. We've already looked at Loki, so you already know that he's a trickster figure, and tricksters are predecessors to the hero. But they're also predecessors or versions of the adversary and the villain type of a character. And of course, if you saw the movie, which hopefully you did, you realize that Loki is the bad guy. But he's more complicated than just being a bad character, right? There's more to him than that. And you're going to see this in the relationship that develops with respect to his parentage. All right, so this particular scene, you're dealing with this idea of they're both born into nobility, they're born among the gods, they're born with a destiny, all that stuff is there. The backstory is they're both fated to rule. And of course, the person that's in the position of mentor is their own father, who is the ultimate wise king. Odin, by the way, is a god of wisdom for the Norse, and right, the one who has a vision of the future. I think we talked about that when we did the death of Baldur, the idea that he sees the future, he knows, in particular, the event of Ragnarok that's coming down the road, right? Okay, so let's take a look at another, I think this is another clip coming up. Not yet, okay. So parent-child relationship is what we're going to be focusing on. Now, the sage, true home, exile, return. Reference back to the original comic book storyline. The movie actually does a really good job sticking to the basic format that was laid out in Marvel Comics way back in the 60s. The original comic origin involved the exile of the character Thor, right? And that's what we're about to look at in the film. So I just want to give you the comic book version of this first. And the idea was that Thor was somehow unworthy, right? He had some character flaws. And he is sent to Earth in the guise of Dr. Donald Blake. This is kind of his alter ego originally in the comic books. Donald Blake was kind of this weak, frail individual, kind of walked with a limp. He needed a walking cane. This walking cane happened to be the thing that he slammed on the ground, and it transformed him into Thor. Okay, this was basically Mjolnir in disguise. Okay, it's part of the magic background for the story. And what happens in the story is, only the person that is worthy. And again, in this lower left-hand panel on the second page here, you'll notice the inscription. If you could read that small print, it says, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." Okay, now those words are almost word for word in the scene we're going to watch in a second. Okay, but this is where it comes from, way back in the day. So this is the goal. Really, the goal is to attain worthiness, okay, and become the character you need to be. And Thor was deficient in the beginning of the comic book story, okay? So it's a redemption tale in a way. So now let's look at the movie origin, and I'm going to jump to the conflict. And let me set the stage a little bit in case you haven't seen the film. The idea in the beginning of the movie is that Thor is going to succeed his father to the throne, kind of like Rama and the Ramayana, except that Rama was a good son and Thor has some flaws. At the moment of this ceremony or this celebration of Thor, becoming the new king or about to become the new king, you've got Asgard broken into by the frost giants, the Jotuns, and they're taken care of, okay? But you find out that Asgard has been breached, and Thor wants payback. Thor wants to investigate and see what's going on, and he actually goes against his father's wishes to Jotunheim to deal with the frost giants, and basically gets in a bad situation there where he has to be rescued by his father, right? Who is much wiser and has had a peace treaty signed with the Jotuns from way back when. All right, so all that has just transpired when we get to this really important tense moment between father and son, which we're going to look at right now.
The Jotuns must learn to fear me, just as they once feared you.
That's pride and vanity talking, not leadership. You've forgotten everything I taught you. But a warrior's patience.
While you wait and be patient, the Nine Realms laugh at us. If the old ways are done, you'd stand giving speeches while Asgard falls.
You are a vain, greedy, cruel boy!
And you are an old man and a fool!
Okay. Anthony Hopkins is great. I think I did the same thing when we looked at Michael Caine as Alfred. I'm always impressed when they cast really good actors in superhero movies because it's so unusual from, back in the day. Anyways, Anthony Hopkins obviously expressing the immaturity of his son. Okay, and again, he calls him a boy, which is really the key word there. Vain, greedy, cruel are other character traits. But the idea of boy, he's immature. He needs to develop. And he sees him as really not having the characteristics of being a good king. And of course, Thor's reaction is just this outrage, right? I mean, obviously, they're both yelling at each other. But Thor, then chastises his father. Calls him a fool, which is a pretty harsh thing to say for the wisest of all leaders, right? This is a guy that has raised him and has kept the realm safe for generations, okay? So that's the tension, right? This is the father-son conflict emerging at this point. Now, let's take a look at the next scene, the consequence of this interaction.
Thor, Odin's son, you have betrayed the express command of your king. Through your arrogance and stupidity, you have opened these peaceful realms and innocent lives to the horror and desolation of war! You are unworthy of these realms. You're unworthy of your title. You're unworthy. I now take from you your power. In the name of my father and his father before. I own it all, father. Cast you off. Whoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor.
Okay, there are the words that we just looked at from the comic book panel, the original. It's the exile moment. Okay, just to add to that description that he gives, not only does he call him a boy, vain, greedy, and cruel, he also expresses the idea that he's stupid. Okay, so there's a lot of negative characteristics in the character of Thor. And he's then sent away, right? So he moved from true home, which is his home on Asgard with his family, with his father, to being cast out and down, right? So we're going to be introduced to the descent, which we're already familiar with in just a second. But this is the exile. This is phase 2 of the family romance. Now, the stages of the romance we could outline in a little bit more detail right now. Actually, some of these are the same, though I'm going to give it a little bit of a different pattern here. Okay. And I'll read through them again. So again, the child, noble birth, the difficult conception, negative prophecy, the child's exposed, the child is rescued, raised by animals or lowly people, and then reared. The hero emerges as the child grows up. There's the discovery of their natural and noble parentage. Then you have vengeance and reconciliation, or vengeance or reconciliation. And in the end, the acknowledgement by the father. So those stages we already looked at. So let's now go and talk about some of the elements in the transition of Thor throughout the film. Okay, let's see how these stages are found or could be found in the movie. Now, stage 1 is obvious, right? He's a child of noble birth. Right there in the beginning, right? He's an Asgardian, right? He can't be more noble than that. He's both God and king, again, according to Norse mythology. Second stage, as far as the conception of the child, that's really not dealt with at all. So we can skip over that one. As far as a negative prophecy goes, there's not really a straightforward prophecy in this movie, but there is the idea of a negative potential should he ascend the throne in the immature state that he's in the beginning of the movie, right? That's obviously a bad thing. The exposure, all right, is the child exposed? Yes, that's what we're at right now. In a way, he's exposed. Number one, he's really not a child, but he is like a child. He's already been called a boy, and he's cast out. This is the exile, right? It's when he's sent away to die in many stories, but here he's not sent away to die, except maybe in a metaphorical sense, right? He's sent to so that the child in him might die and he might emerge the man that he needs to be and the king that he should become. And notice that he's sent down, and I'm not going to show you the whole clip of this, but he's sent down to Earth. And this is the scene that you're looking at on the screen where he first arrives on Midgard, okay? Remember the realms that we have already studied briefly, maybe Asgard is the home of the gods, Midgard is Earth. Okay, and here he is in the desert at night, and I'll point out again those elements in the time and place that he arrives a little bit later. Okay, but that's this stage here, and he's rescued by commoners. I mean, for the most part, they're obviously not gods; they're not kings. They may be educated scientists, etc., but respectively speaking, they're lowly people. As far as him being reared, this is where I might be stretching it just a little bit. In a way, Jane helps him develop, right, in the course of the story. Now, she's a romantic interest, so it's not literally that she raises him as a mother figure. I don't want to go in the same direction I did when I talked about Bruce Wayne and his relationship with Rachel in the Batman Begins movie. I kind of hinted at, or maybe not hinted at, I was kind of explicit that Rachel fulfills not only a romantic role, but also a motherly role, kind of an Oedipal situation there. But, Jane's last name happens to be Foster, which I think is interesting. I don't think it's taken directly from the idea that the child would be fostered by some kind of person and raised, but the character basically comes from the comic books with that name, so I'm almost positive that name just happens to be a coincidence. But again, she is going to be instrumental in his development. Okay, so then the hero is going to emerge. In the course of the story, you're going to notice what happens to him is you go from being this incredibly arrogant, vain, cruel, greedy boy to humility. Okay, and again, just like Gilgamesh had to be broken of his selfishness and arrogance and become humbled with his encounter with Enkidu, Thor is going to need to go through the same thing here on Earth, and that's what's going to allow the transformation to take place. All right, he doesn't really need to discover his natural parents. He's going to have to go back to them in the course of the story, and there'll be a reconciliation with the father by the end, and an acknowledgement at the very end of his place as his father's son. Okay, that's all in the movie, and it's fairly well done. What makes it a little bit different than the traditional family romance, where it deviates from Rank's birth of the hero myth, is that this is usually, at least the exile, the exposure, all the prophecy, all that kind of stuff, usually takes place in early childhood, right? Because the family romance is about the development from early childhood. They don't do that in the movie. This is obviously an adult, but again, he's called a boy, so that's close enough. And he normally does have foster parents. He really doesn't know his identity. Okay, but like I said, these are general stages, and there are all kinds of stories that break the rules, not only with Campbell's scenario, but with the Ranks scenario as well. So there's a general pattern, and I think it upholds or sticks to the pattern for the most part. All right, now let's take a look, speaking of Campbell, in Thor as the hero's journey, right? We're going to go back to that old monomyth 3-part breakdown of separation, initiation, and return. I'm just going to mention this briefly. I don't want to walk through that whole process again with you, but we just saw the call to adventure. Right? Now, the call to adventure is what's issued in the beginning of the story that's going to begin the separation of the hero and bring them out into the world of adventure for that initiation phase. And Campbell always says that you have the call to adventure, and then there's somehow a refusal of the call. Now, in this movie, you could think of the exile as kind of the call to adventure, right? He's going to be sent out by his father with a goal in mind. I mean, the goal is, of course, that he becomes mature. And there's definitely a reluctance. He doesn't actually avoid the call the way some heroes do, trying to reject the call, because he doesn't have a choice in it. He's actually cast literally down by Odin's power to Earth. But it's definitely not a willing undertaking of this quest, of this journey. Okay, so Thor is definitely a reluctant hero in the course of the movie. Crosses the first threshold in that same scene as he goes through the portal from one realm to the other. And again, you can think of the setup with Asgard, by the way, and the Rainbow Bridge, right, Bifrost, which is the thing that connects Asgard to Midgard. They don't actually use this in this scene, but there's a lot of that in the movie. This idea of the bridge that is the threshold crossing from one realm to another. A lot of that kind of motion in the story. All right, but he crosses the threshold, the real threshold for his adventure, and it's also the beginning of the descent at the same time, because he literally goes down to the earth and he falls to the ground. Actually, that's like a comet, hitting the Earth from the sky. Not really a comet, more like a asteroid hitting the Earth as he plummets down. And of course, the hammer as well in a separate spot. Okay, but it's a descent. And notice the descent is in the dark, and it's in the desert. It's in a harsh territory. It really is like a fall into the underworld. And with it goes loss of identity. Not that he doesn't remember who he is, but you have the idea that he isn't who he was, right? He doesn't have his power. He doesn't have his clothing. All that kind of stuff has been stripped off of him, and he needs to learn again who he needs to become, right? So that's the idea here. The other thing that's kind of interesting in the way they do it in the movie is when we talk about going into that world of adventure during the initiation phase, which is Act 2, the big portion of the story, it's usually off into the realm of fantasy and wonder and magic and challenge. And here in the movie, you actually started in the realm that was the more fantastic realm, right? The audience, when they go into the theater, and I remember seeing this in the theater for the first time, and the CGI in the movie at the time, it was top notch. I mean, it was a stunning visual that you get of Asgard as it's first introduced. Matter of fact, you come up through the water, almost like you're crossing that threshold yourself, and you see Asgard laid out in all of its color and splendor, and it's amazing. Okay, so that's the world he begins in, and he ends up in a twist, right? He ends up in a world that is not only ordinary, but the most ordinary that you can possibly imagine. He's in the desert, right? Basically, I think it's New Mexico, if I'm remembering correctly. Okay, so it's dry, it's dead. The town that he ends up in is barely beyond a ghost town. All right, it's obviously not a ghost town because there are people still living there, but it's so small there's only like one traffic light. All right, so he goes from the fantastic into the ordinary, which is a neat twist and reversal, like I said, on the general way that these stories progress. All right, so now that we're in the scenario, he's in the midst of the initiation, let's talk about the transformation and start with the quest. The quest begins with the quest for the hammer, right? He knows that it's there. He's going to go after it. It's sitting there, and all kinds of other people have tried to, find it. They found it, but they're trying to pull it out, which is one of the most enjoyable scenes in the movie, where all the people, got the pickup trucks gathered around the crater, and everybody's trying to pull the thing out of the ground. And of course, you've got the, typical cameo appearance by Stan Lee as he tries to pull it out with his pickup truck. But that's what he's after. So, as an item, that's the quest. But there's more to it than possession of a hammer, because the hammer represents something. And that was given to us when Odin whispers to it before he throws it through the portal. And the true quest is what it represents, which is the virtue, the idea of being worthy, right? To become the certain type of person you need to become. So the ultimate quest for Thor is not the hammer so much as the worthiness. He needs to be worthy. As a matter of fact, we're going to see what happens when he actually tries to take the hammer in just a second. But let's follow this out just a little bit. All right, his identity is going to transform. Stage 1, he's a boy, right? Vain, greedy, and cruel, as Odin says. But then he's going to start step by step transforming. Okay, so we're going to go from that older picture, the Jack Kirby illustration of Thor, to an Arthur Adams version of Thor much later. He's becoming mature, right? This is a humbling experience, and you're going to notice how he becomes humble in the course of the story. I'm going to point out one scene right now. It's not the major scene. I'll show you the scene where it's the true humiliation is brought upon him, but I want to draw your attention to, again, if you haven't seen the movie, go back and pay attention to the use of food and banquet, the scenes that are usually around the dining table in the film. When he first is chastised by Odin, before he's exiled, in his rage, there's this scene with this huge banquet table, which he flips over, right? I mean, just showing his power. This thing is massive, okay? Displaying, again, not only his power and his strength, but the raw anger and fury, right? He's kind of like a Heracles, kind of out of control to a degree, okay? And immature, right? He's not handling things the way he ought. So, again, that is there. When he first comes to Earth, you notice as he's having a little breakfast, basically in the diner, with the people that have found him, he's drinking the coffee, right, for the first time. And he's a guy that loves sensation and pleasure and, fine food and that kind of stuff. And he's never tasted coffee before, so he loves it. And he slams the glass on the ground, or the cup on the ground, and asks for another. And again, kind of showing his unfamiliarity with earthly customs and him being kind of the brash, bold figure that he was back in Asgard. Nothing too offensive. It's kind of done in a lighthearted manner, but again, situated at the diner. So you get these scenes where he's around food. Okay. Now, his behavior begins to change a little bit after the scene I'm going to show you very shortly, but you'll notice there's another scene where they're having breakfast, and you see Thor actually serving the others, right? He's making the food and he's serving the plates to the others. That is a very subtle way that they're trying to introduce you to the changing character, right? His personality is already changing. He's not the guy who's sitting there being waited on hand and foot, acting like a god, demanding another cup of something like that. He's out there doing something different. He's humbled. Okay, so that's important, again, in the transformation process. What we want to see emerge is him becoming more self-sacrificial, which we'll get to near the end. Okay, so that's kind of stage 2, the beginning of the humiliation. Okay, and I mean humiliation in a good way. Okay, and finally we get towards the end of the movie, and he's going to become, as you would expect, his father's son, right? Thor, Odin's son, right? It's a traditional way that you might say it in the Scandinavian tradition. So he's going to literally become his father, okay? Maybe not literally, you know what I mean. He's going to become the way he ought to be, right? The man who is worthy to become king and take his father's place and learn his father's lessons and, have this reconciliation with his father. That's the mature Thor. That's the one that we need to get to by the end of the film. All right, so let's go back just slightly before the humiliation. We'll talk about the descent into death and how this manifests as the breaking point for him, right? All hero stories need a descent. They need a conquest of death. That's one of the 2 essential elements of all hero narratives. Now, stage 1, he's cast down to earth. That's important, right? We saw him plummet into the desert, but that's not the end of the descent. The descent goes further. And the descent reaches its lowest point in a very important scene where he arrives at the complex built around the crater where the hammer has landed, right? S.H.I.E.L.D. has constructed this complex. They've kind of gotten rid of everybody else. They're going to analyze and figure out what this thing is. And he knows he needs to go in there and attain the boon, right? The Holy Grail, the thing that he's after. And there it is. So let's look at this very briefly, the scene where he's going to get the hammer.
Better call it, Coulson. 'Cause I'm starting to root for this guy. Last chance, sir.
Wait. I want to see this.
Okay. I love the way they do the scene with the atmosphere, with the music. They kind of set you up. Obviously, he's descending into the pit, right? You're already descending into the underworld if you know anything about the Greek underworld. I mean, Hades isn't the lowest place. There are lower places within Hades that you can sink to, right? Tartarus. Here is kind of like Thor's Tartarus. He's at night, right? It's dark. It's rainy. The storm is set. He has to get into the complex and get through the guys guarding it. And any kind of descent into the underworld is usually going to lead you again through various stages and challenges and things that you have to overcome as you penetrate towards the center of the labyrinth and the center of the pit. And when he gets there, you know, the music is going. It's like, you know, the moment of accomplishment. You kind of have this upward trend in the music, and then all of a sudden as he lays his hands on the thing, you hear the music kind of trail off into despair, right? They kind of lead you through the emotions that the character is going through. Even the expressions on his face, right? He's, you know, has this look of joy on his face for one split second before, you know, it's utter failure. This is like Gilgamesh again, right? When he goes on the quest to find the secret of immortality, he arrives at the land of Dilmun after this horrible ordeal across the waters of death, and he finally arrives, and what happens to him when he gets there? Failure, right? He doesn't get what he's after. Same thing with Thor. He thinks it's right there in his grasp, yet it's so far from him, okay? And he shouts out in the end in agony. That's the beginning of the breaking point for him, okay? It's right after that that we actually have the scene where he has an encounter with his brother who's kind of set this whole thing up. And, you know, this idea of humility and, you know, wanting to apologize for his arrogance, all that kind of stuff is already going through the character's mind at that moment, okay? But that's the important point. That's the important point for the transformation, because once you hit the bottom, there's no place else to go, hopefully, than back up. And that's what we're going to see emerge. He's been humiliated. He's now going to transform, and he's going to internalize that humbleness, right, and to become the mature character that he needs to be. Now, let's turn towards the culmination of the movie, right? As things reach the pinnacle, right? We're in Act 2. We're progressing towards the end of Act 2, where you're ultimately going to have the conquest of death as far as the conflict with the main enemy, which is going to be his brother. I'm going to set that off a little bit because there's something more important that takes place before his engagement with Loki at the end of the film, and that's where he's finally able to sacrifice himself for the good of others, right? Like, again, Gilgamesh, who decides not to eat of the plant of eternal youth and rather save it for the old men back in Uruk, Thor is going to go out. Thor is going to go out and... Sorry, I had to change that. Things pop up on my screen against my will. He's going to go out and he's going to do the thing that he needs to do and lay down his life. This is going to be the ultimate sacrifice. So let's take a look at the scene, and then we'll take a look at, you know, some of the things that are pulled into the scene from elsewhere, what kind of inspired this scene. So here's the scene first.
Brother, whatever I have done to wrong you, whatever I have done to lead you to do this, I am truly sorry, but these people are innocent. Taking their lives will gain you nothing. So take mine and end this.
Okay. He's making the ultimate sacrifice. I mean, he just says it, you know, take my life instead of theirs. That's the action of the hero, right? The idea of being a savior, we said, was one of the three most important characteristics that a hero has to have. It's what makes them a hero, right? The ability to die. And in doing so, of course, you set yourself up as the role model, right? Because remember, the hero is supposed to teach you how to live, the type of virtues you need to embody. And, you know, part of that lesson is how to die the right way. Okay, so here he is laying down his life for other people, which is, you know, like I said, the ultimate sacrifice. Now, it doesn't look like he's he doesn't think this is about to happen, but I want to pay attention to how this works out, because we're going to see the next little clip. But I also want to point out, notice how he lands, and what kind of inspires this scene is, I'll get to in a second. Let's take a look at this issue of the resurrection, okay? Because we're about to look at a resurrection in the film, which is modeled on the picture we get from the New Testament, all right? The idea of the Christ figure. So again, pay attention to the position that he's in. As he gets knocked back and struck by this incredibly powerful force, he lands in what is essential, almost like a crucifixion pose, right? On the ground, dying with his arms outstretched. Now, I don't think it was accidental. I tend to think that directors and writers think of these things as they put a film together. There's very often, very well chosen shots. Again, if you're a good movie maker, and if you don't know anything about the director of this film, Kenneth Branagh directed the movie, and he is a fantastic director, but also a fantastic actor. If you don't know who that is, very famous for his rendition of Hamlet that he did years back, but you might be more familiar with him from the Harry Potter films. He played Gilderoy Lockhart in the second Harry Potter movie, Chamber of Secrets. So that's who directed this movie. Anyways, he's a Shakespearean actor, but I'm almost positive that he knows exactly what he's drawing on with the dialogue and the way this film wraps out. So I want you to also watch the way the rest of this scene works out, and then we'll come back to some of the reasons I think this is really is drawn on the New Testament imagery here. So let's take a look at the scene first.
It's over.
No, it's not over.
You're safe. It's over.
Okay, abrupt ending to the clip. Probably should have broken that clip into two parts. The part where he died and the part where he came back. As far as the resurrection scene, it's a pretty quick turnaround. But clearly, he's drawing on this imagery. And the reason I say this is not just the pose that he landed in and the fact that he comes back to life, but very clearly the words that he utters right before he dies were drawn from the Christian tradition as well. Like his last words were, "It is over." Okay, he talks about them being safe, so there's this whole idea of safeness or salvation tied into that. And the reference here is actually to the Gospel of John 19:30, where Jesus' last words are, "It is finished." Basically, it's over, right? And then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. All right, that's what the text of the New Testament says there. And then the Gospel of Mark actually has kind of the follow-up after he dies. You get the centurion saying, "Surely this man was the Son of God." That's in Mark 15:39. And notice, of course, Jane's words as she sees him come back, kind of a more modern rendition of that, like, "Oh my God." Okay, so it's that same type of idea, and I'm pretty sure they're drawing on that imagery. Okay, and it's a powerful image, right? This is the ultimate conquest of death that we look for in these hero stories, right? So you've got the resurrection, the rising, and this is the completion of the transformation for him, right? The reason that he comes back, the reason that he has the hammer is because he's done exactly what it takes to be the mature person. He's now transformed into the character that Odin wants him to be, somebody worthy of being king, okay? So with his transformation complete, let's just take a quick look at Loki and the family romance, because the other major character is obviously the brother. Now, the brother is the trickster. He's the villain. He's the bad guy of the story, but in a very real sense, he goes through a similar transformation, a similar family romance. Okay, so with those same stages, let's take a look at Loki's development and how he goes through the various stages. So, very clearly, he is a child of noble birth.
Small for a giant's offspring. Abandoned, suffering, left to die. Laufey's son.
Laufey's son.
Yes.
Why? You were knee-deep in Jotun blood. Why would you take me?
You were an innocent child.
No. You took me for a purpose. What was it? Tell me!
I thought we could unite our kingdoms one day, bring about an alliance, bring about a permanent peace through you. But those plans no longer matter.
So I am no more than another stolen relic, locked up here until you might have use of me.
Why do you twist my
You could
words?
have told me what I was from the beginning. Why didn't you?
You're my son. I wanted only to protect you from the truth.
What? Because I'm the monster that parents tell their children about at night?
No.
You know, it all makes sense now. Why you favored Thor all these years. Because no matter how much you claim to love me, you could never have a frost giant sitting on the throne of Asgard.
Okay. So when you say he's got a noble birth, it's not just that he's the son of Odin, he's the adopted son of Odin, but his actual parentage is the king of the frost giants, the king of the Jotuns, right? Laufey in the story. Even though in the actual Norse mythology, Laufey was his mother, kind of a trivia point right there. But we've got the background, okay? We don't know very much about his conception. Whether it was difficult or not, doesn't really say. The idea of a prophecy is essentially here in that Odin is going to see the potential of using him, right, to unite these people or to bring about a permanent peace, right? And the fact that he was earlier mentioned to be born to be a king is, again, part of his destiny. He happens to be a frost giant that he was referring to, a frost giant king, but nonetheless. Now, the child is exposed, right? He's abandoned in the temple. This is where Odin finds him after the war with the Jotuns. So he's rescued, not by lowly people, but by other people, right? A different race. So we could say that you definitely have, the fostering. He's not raised by his actual parents, but he's raised by Frigg. Didn't really talk about her very much, but she has a minor role to play in the movie, and you should already know that Frigg is the mother of, Balder from the story that we read before. Now, he's going to grow up, and he's not going to emerge as a hero, but he will emerge in a different way. He's going to be, of course, the trickster. And then he's going to discover who his actual parents are. He's going to discover right here in this scene that his father happens to be the king of the frost giants. Now, the vengeance aspect is interesting. So let's watch the scene where he exacts vengeance upon the father. It looks like it's going to be Odin, the way this thing has been set up. But there's a little bit of a twist in here, and I thought it was kind of a pleasant change.
So that you may know your death came at the hand of Laufey.
And your death came by the son of Odin.
Okay, so here's the idea where Rank speaks about taking vengeance upon the original father. Okay, so he's obviously picking his foster father over his actual father, which is a good twist. Not necessarily a twist from the Rankian model, but maybe not exactly what you were expecting in the movie, since he is characterized as a bad guy. But the interesting thing about the way they portray Loki, and again, this is, I think, fairly consistent with Norse mythology, is that even though he's a trickster and has these villainous aspects to him, he's not universally bad. Obviously, in the Death of Balder storyline, he is, almost evil incarnate. But in many other stories, as we'll see when we get to the Volsunga saga in our next session, Loki often plays a role, again, of a trickster who's sometimes on the side of the gods. So here he's clearly standing up for his relationship with Odin, and he is seeking to be acknowledged by that father. And of course, there's the question mark there, whether or not he's going to be acknowledged by Odin. Has he done something that's going to be pleasing to his father? Has he developed into the person that he needs to be? Now, the similarities, again, with Rank's story, I think, are more on par here than they are with Thor, right? This does take place, again, it's a reference back to his early childhood with the exposure and the being fostered by the Asgardians. And that whole idea of the foster parents is right there. So as far as the two characters go, the myth of the birth of the hero lines up with both of them, but it actually lines up more so with the development of the Loki character. But I like the way the movie deals with both of them, okay, which is why I wanted to kind of handle rank, which we wouldn't probably have had a chance to discuss if it wasn't for being able to analyze it in the context of this movie. Last thing I'm just going to throw at you are some questions which are just going to be there for your personal thought, and you can feel free to, text them to me, your ideas, for discussion at some other point. But right now, these are some questions that you might want to ask yourself. Number one, what do you think of Rank's theory? As a psychological theory dealing with the development of a child and their relationship with their parents, and how it relates to the development of the hero myth. Okay, so what do you think? Is he on track? And how important is the Oedipal aspect of this? Do you have to have that aspect for this to make sense? You have to buy into Oedipal theory. Again, I don't think this movie makes much of the Oedipal theory, but again, you got to remember that's in the background of Rank's thinking, very, very influenced by Freud, his mentor. Also, what does it say about heroism? As far as what is a hero? The hero manifesting in the light of this relationship within the family. That might be a little different than you normally think about heroes. Okay, so what does it say about heroes, and what does it say about us as individuals, right? I mean, Rank's theory is that this applies to the development of the child, right? Is this accurate about our personal development and the relationships that we have within the family structure? Or what other ways can we understand kind of a father-son rivalry or any other kind of rivalry within the family? Okay, are there better ways to understand it than through Rank's model? How well did Marvel actually handle the story? That might be something that you could talk about pretty easily, whether you thought this was a really well-done movie. There are 3 Thor movies that Marvel has produced, right? Thor, Thor the Dark World, and Thor Ragnarok, at least up to the point of this lecture. There are going to be, there's a 4th one actually on the horizon right now. But when you ask people what's your favorite Thor movie, most people, from my experience, say number 3. Maybe the second most common answer would be the first movie, which is the one obviously that we've been talking about, and then the second one kind of shows up as usually the last one. This one was kind of serious, right? It's a really good hero story. Most origin stories tend to be really good examples of hero narrative for some reason. But again, since we're talking about transformation stories, it's usually the origin story that's about the transformation of the hero. The second movie, I think, was a little bit darker, not as humorous, even though this movie was serious and I think a well-done version of a hero's origin story. It also had lighthearted points to it, which I think is really a good thing to include. You don't want to be overly serious when you're dealing with superhero movies. The second movie, a little bit more serious, a little bit more dark, not as good a story. The third movie, if you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend seeing Thor Ragnarok. It's not going to give you a good rendition of the traditional myth of Ragnarok, which again has to do with the end of things, right? The destruction of the universe and the battle between the gods and the frost giants at the end. But it is a brilliant comedy, if you want to look at it in that light, because it truly is a very comic take on the story of Thor. And then, how might this movie function like a myth? We've seen that in the beginning of the semester. We talked about various ways myths function, whether it's, cosmological, sociological, pedagogical, epistemological. I give you a whole bunch of different functions. And you can look at this movie and see, does it function in a similar way? Does the story do something for the audience or to the audience that you would expect a good myth to do, right? Does it resonate with you? Does it walk you through transitional phases of life? Right? I mean, that's the whole idea of the family romance, but does the audience get a benefit out of it as well? So I'm going to leave you with those basic questions. I'm not going to answer those questions for you, but if you haven't seen the movie, I definitely recommend you seeing the movie Thor. And then our next lecture, we're going to stick with the Norse tradition. So we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Volsunga saga, or Sigurd the Volsung.